Just while you're thinking about what you really want these people to talk about, let me pose one general point. Tim said in his speech, I think absolutely rightly, that if we want to change policy and change the way people think about economics, we need to not just reform theory and so on and so forth, but we have to come up with an alternative narrative. I think this is absolutely true, that politics and indeed even academic economic ideas are actually driven by these broad narratives. And that's something we can all agree on. But actually, if you think about the four presentations we've had today, the problem is that the alternative view of the world, the alternative to the neoclassical liberal consensus, doesn't actually have a consistent narrative. And even today, I think we heard a number of very powerful presentations, but which appear in their general intentions to be consistent, but which actually in their nature are highly contradictory. So Anne, for instance, told us that the purpose of the money system, and it's an incredibly powerful human invention, I completely agree with her, is to enable people to do what they want to do, to be able to create, to be able to produce, to be able to work, and that above all, what public policy should be directed to is to creating employment. But can we really create employment without economic growth? Are people going to work without incomes? I think that is questionable. And so there is really a contradiction, I think, between Anne's view of the world and that presented by Molly and to some extent by Tim about the limits to growth, about the fact that we need to, about the idea that we need to move to an ex-growth world economy. Now, can these issues be reconciled? Can we have continuing full employment? Can we have continuing rise in income and in welfare spending by governments, which most people in this room probably agree would be desirable, while having a world economy or even a national economy that has gone ex-growth? I'd like to put that question to the panel and then turn to the floor. But who'd like to comment on that? Yes, Anne.
A very good question and something I'm regularly challenged on. I'd say yes. I mean, first of all, growth is not part of what I think our narrative should be, our alternative narrative. We don't need a narrative of growth. The narrative of growth has been invented, in my view, by the rentiers, by those who want exponential rates of growth, exponential rates of interest rates, simple and compound interest rate, if you like. What we should be about is, in my view, full employment. What we should be about is substituting labour for carbon. Now, it's easy for me to say that. It's going to be much harder to do, and I don't have a simple answer to that question, Anatole. But, for example, I heard Mr. Medvedev say 2 days ago that unless the West kind of climbed down, he was going to ban, they were going to ban, the Russians are going to ban aircraft flying over Russia. Now, that could happen tomorrow, and then airlines would go out of business. We'd have a very serious problem. And so instead of importing our green beans from Kenya, we'd have to start growing green beans, and we're quite capable of growing green beans. But at the moment, the way the global system is constructed, we don't think we need to grow green beans. We don't think we need horticultural departments, as someone told us last night. We think we can get it from Kenya. And that's the frame of mind that has to change. Now, when we start growing our own green beans, to put it crudely, that will be labour-intensive activity. Substituting labour for carbon means that you will have a full employment economy. How you then manage the money system, Anatole, is the thing that what central bankers are trained to do. They're trained to ensure that we don't use money for speculation. We use it for activity that generates income, to pay those pensions, to pay those salaries. And they don't have to be high. They don't have to be high in a more sustainable economy. But they also need, the monetary authorities have to manage the system so that we don't create more money than the capacity of the economy for full employment. Now that's the job for the experts, it's not the job for you and me. Our job is to ensure that full employment becomes a big value and a most important priority for our economy. At the moment it's very, very way down the list of priorities.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I agree with Anne with her message of relocalising economies, and I actually think resilient local economies are very important in the era of climate change, because I think transport systems will be much less reliable than they are now. I also agree with her point about rehabilitation of manual labour, although I think that's much more difficult to achieve, because after all, you know, I'm not sure I would be very useful in all sorts of roles which I might have to undertake if we were using petroleum less than we use it now. But I think that's a debate that we should be having, rather than just constantly relying on fossil fuels. If we take climate change seriously, then the way we power our economy is going to change, and that might mean us having to, particularly, for example, walk upstairs rather than take a lift, as maybe we did this morning, but a huge range of things like that. But I think I wouldn't agree that full employment is part of the narrative we're moving towards, because I think full employment implies a particular thing about how we generate our own livelihoods. And I think from a green economics point of view, we're actually raising that as a question, because I think somewhere in the 19th century, people accepted that they were wage labour, and that rather than, and my suggestion would be that we move towards that and we give people access to resources, and they meet more of their own needs through their own skills and through their own work, rather than accessing a market, so selling their labour in a market and then buying what they need through the market. So I think that's a way of rethinking what work means and what it's for, and the relationship between work and meeting our own needs through sustainable livelihoods.
David, would you like to comment on that? Because I think this also has a relationship with the wage conundrum that you mentioned, because if we're talking about full employment or less marketized employment, we're also talking about lower wages.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess there would have to be some acceptance that the resources that each of us have at our disposal would have to decline, if that's, you know, but obviously that's quite a conceivable but a very difficult political sell, it seems to me. I mean, there are two key issues, I think, that both contributions have raised. One is about globalization, and the other is about technical change. And both of these have had a massive effect on our economy. Localizing the economy, I'm quite sympathetic to, but then there are knock-on effects. I was reading by the textile trade in Bangladesh the other day, which is really dependent on the globalized system of communication and so on. And what it has done, we may all think it's a pretty awful thing, what it has done is it's allowed many more girls to go to school than were ever capable of going to school in the past, because the wages of the relatively poor in Bangladesh have been raised, not to what anything like what Westerners would consider an acceptable standard, but there are difficulties if we do go around. Well, we've got to accept that there are always pluses and minuses when we make major changes.
Jim?
Yeah, I pick up the point you were making about comparing what seems to be a very easy way in which, I'm trying not to say the right, in which proponents of neoliberalism seem to be able to agree at a very basic level, and all people who want some sort of change, some reinvention of the economy to deliver these other things don't seem to be able to do that. I'd say two things about that. The first thing I'd say is it wasn't always so, and it took several decades to end up with the Heritage Foundation saying free markets, limited government, free of the individual American values, and something about defence. And as the things that in actual fact brought them together. So what I would say is that, interestingly, the people who want to do this reinvention, which is like people in this room and others, the key here is not trying to answer a technical question at any one time or having a debate, but to find a way of standing back to find what the commonality of ground is. I worked for a long while for a large or major NGO, And you end up feeling, if you're in an NGO, that your agenda is absolutely right, and if only you go and tell them, and if only they realise that the environment, poverty, whichever it happens to be, is the most important thing and everything else flows from that, then that will be okay. And there needs to be a way in which we're able to stand back and debate. So one of the things that we've got going at the moment, we've got some money at a European level to bring together academics and policymakers from this area to try and find what are the principles about how an economy operates. I think the main thing is it's not easy, and I would argue that getting stuck on the growth question is a bit of a red herring some of the time, in the fact that if you look at the immediate thing about delivering livelihoods and living wages to people and being able to invest in low carbon delivery, some of those answers will come. There isn't a set of answers that are just ready to be found. These will evolve as these things happen. The key thing is the way in which we operate together and our ability to be able to not fight each other, but in actual fact operate as having a common purpose. Because that, in fact, is why neoliberalism has been able to reinvent itself. Those principles underlie each stage of it since 1979.
Yeah, I very much agree. One of the reasons I called my book Capitalism 4.0 was what I argued is that in the previous three phases, you had sub-phases. In the first phase, there was great confusion in the 1930s and the 1860s and so on. And I think perhaps now we're moving from 4.0 to 4.1 when there's a little bit of a convergence.